Amelia Evans had always believed in the power of hard work. As a neurosurgeon at one of Chicago's most prestigious hospitals, she had earned everything she had, from her sharp medical skills to the respect of her peers. She had sacrificed much, years of sleepless nights, relationships that had come and gone, and a personal life that had been put on hold for the sake of her career. Yet despite all her achievements, there was one thing Amelia had never found: love. Her heart had been scarred by past relationships, where she had been overlooked or taken for granted. But all of that changed the night she met Ethan Wells at a charity gala. He was everything Amelia had never expected in a man: charming, confident, and undeniably attractive. Ethan came from old money, the kind of wealth that defined entire families and shaped their lives. He was the heir to the Wells fortune, and everything about him exuded a life of privilege. Amelia, ever the skeptic, had doubts from the start. She knew she was an outsider in Ethan's world. She had built her career from the ground up, never relying on family wealth or connections. Her success had been hers alone, and she had earned every inch of it. Ethan's world was different. It was a world where everything came easily: money, status, and legacy, and Amelia wasn't sure she could ever truly fit in. But there was something about Ethan that intrigued her. He was unlike any man she had met before. Their connection was undeniable, and they quickly became inseparable. Lavish dinners followed by long walks through the city, whispered promises of a future together, and the kind of intimacy that only comes with true understanding. They moved fast, so fast that, within months, Ethan proposed. The proposal was nothing short of breathtaking. Surrounded by candles, a sky full of stars, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore, Ethan knelt before her, offering a ring that sparkled in the moonlight. Amelia had always dreamed of a simple life, far removed from the drama and excess that surrounded her, but in that moment, she saw Ethan's sincerity. She said yes, her heart racing with a mix of joy and fear. But despite the beauty of the moment, something inside her remained unsettled. There was a gap between them, a chasm of difference between their worlds that she wasn't sure could ever be bridged. Ethan's family, his entire legacy, loomed over their relationship, and Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to be swallowed by it. The wealth, the expectations, the traditions. Could she survive in a world so different from the one she had worked so hard to create for herself? Despite her reservations, she moved forward with the wedding. She wanted to believe that love would conquer all, that they could overcome the differences between them. But deep down, she knew she was stepping into something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Marriage to Ethan Wells would mean marriage to everything that came with his name: his family, their legacy, their expectations. Could she truly fit into that world, or would she lose herself in the process? The wedding date was set, and as the days drew nearer, Amelia's doubts grew. She loved Ethan with all her heart, but she feared what his family might think of her, what they might do to her once she was bound to them for life. The Wells family was known for their wealth, their influence, and their rigid social structures. They had their own way of doing things, and Amelia was certain she would never be able to live up to their expectations. Would she ever be able to fit in? Or would she forever be the outsider in a world she couldn't understand? The day of the wedding arrived, and Amelia stood before the mirror, looking at herself in the wedding dress she had chosen. She had imagined this day countless times, but never like this. There was a sense of dread settling in her chest as she thought about what lay ahead. Would she be able to handle the pressure, the scrutiny, the weight of the family she was about to marry into? She glanced at the ring on her finger, her promise to Ethan. Her heart ached with uncertainty, but she reminded herself that love could overcome anything, right? Ethan stood by her side as they walked down the aisle, his hand warm and steady in hers. She tried to push away the nagging doubts, to focus on the love they shared, but as she caught sight of his parents in the front row, Victoria and Charles Wells, the reality of her situation hit her like a cold wave. They didn't look happy, not at all. They didn't even look approving. The cold politeness in their eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't a joyous occasion for them. For the Wells family, it felt more like a formality, something they had to endure. The ceremony was small, intimate, but the lack of celebration stung.
No extravagant displays, no large party afterward.
It was almost as if they were tolerating the marriage, rather than celebrating it. The guests whispered behind champagne glasses, their eyes scanning her with curiosity, evaluating her as an outsider. Amelia couldn't help but feel the weight of their judgment. As she exchanged vows with Ethan, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Had she made a mistake? She loved him with everything she had, but the enormity of what she was about to enter into was starting to overwhelm her. She had imagined a different kind of wedding, a different kind of family. The one she was about to marry into felt like a gilded cage. After the ceremony, Ethan reassured her, his voice soft and comforting as they shared their first moments as husband and wife. "Give them time," he whispered, his arms around her. Amelia wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that everything would be okay. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Wells family would never fully accept her. They would never see her as one of their own. The questions and doubts began to swirl in her mind, but she pushed them aside for the moment, trying to focus on the joy of being with Ethan. After all, she had made her choice. She had married him, and she was committed to their future together. But even as she clung to that hope, a small voice inside her asked, would love truly be enough to overcome everything else? As the evening wore on, and they slipped away from the reception to begin their new life together, Amelia couldn't help but wonder, what had she truly signed up for? The weeks that followed their wedding were nothing like the fairy tale Amelia had imagined. As much as Ethan tried to reassure her, the cracks in their new life together were impossible to ignore. What had been a whirlwind romance, full of passion and excitement, was quickly overshadowed by the unspoken tension that lingered between Amelia and the Wells family. The wedding, which should have been a joyous celebration, had only served to highlight just how little they cared for her. She wasn't the bride they had hoped for, and it was clear that, in their eyes, she would never be worthy of their son. The Wells family wasn't just wealthy, they were powerful, and their influence stretched far beyond their impressive mansion in the heart of the city. Their name was synonymous with old money, with a legacy that had been carefully cultivated over generations. Amelia was an outsider in every sense of the word. She wasn't born into that world, and no matter how much Ethan loved her, the family she had married into could not, and would not, accept her. Their wedding had been a mere formality, something they had endured for the sake of appearances. Ethan's parents, Victoria and Charles, hadn't even bothered to hide their disapproval. The ceremony had been smaller than Amelia had expected, almost deliberately so. There were no extravagant decorations, no lavish dinner, no grand reception. Just a simple, quiet affair that reflected the Wells family's cold indifference. The wedding wasn't a celebration of their love, it was a begrudging acknowledgement of it, as though they were merely tolerating Amelia's presence. Amelia had tried to convince herself it was nothing. She'd assured herself that it would get better, that she would prove herself to them over time. But the silence from Ethan's family only grew louder. Every time she walked into a room, conversations would halt, leaving a tense, awkward silence in their wake. When she tried to engage with Ethan's mother, Victoria, the woman's responses were always polite but distant. There was no warmth, no sign of affection or support. Amelia couldn't help but feel as though she were invisible, as though the life she had built for herself, a life of achievement, hard work and ambition, meant nothing in this new world she had entered. Ethan, ever the optimist, tried to smooth over the tension. He assured her that his family simply needed time to adjust, that they weren't used to having someone like her in their lives. Give them time, he would say, as though that would magically solve everything. But Amelia wasn't convinced. She had seen the way they looked at her, the way they treated her with thinly veiled disdain. It wasn't just about time. It was about acceptance, and that was something she wasn't sure she would ever receive. One evening, after an especially quiet dinner with Ethan's parents, Amelia found herself retreating to their room, her heart heavy with frustration. She had tried so hard to fit in, to be what they wanted her to be. She had made small talk, dressed the way they expected, even changed her own behavior to meet their standards. But it was never enough. It would never be enough. Ethan came in shortly after, his usual comforting self. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and kissed her forehead. "They'll come around," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Just give it time." But Amelia didn't feel comforted. In fact, she felt more alone than ever before. The woman she had once been, the driven, independent surgeon, was being buried under the weight of expectations she could never meet. Every move she made felt like a misstep, every word she spoke seemed wrong. She was failing, and not just at the hands of her in-laws. She was failing herself. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Amelia found herself more and more isolated. She was no longer the center of Ethan's world. The Wells family had a way of making her feel like an outsider in her own marriage, like a piece of furniture in their grand estate. She was an accessory, something to be looked at but never truly acknowledged. It wasn't just Victoria and Charles who made her feel like an intruder. Even Ethan's friends, The ones who had attended their wedding, who had celebrated their love in the beginning, now seemed distant, disinterested. Amelia had thought they were her friends, but it became clear that their loyalty lay with Ethan's family, not with her. The few times she had tried to spend time with them, she was met with polite smiles but cool indifference. They had all been groomed by the Wells legacy, and she, the ambitious surgeon with no history in their world, would never be more than an outsider. The isolation weighed heavily on Amelia. She spent hours in the sprawling mansion, wandering its grand hallways, feeling more and more like a ghost. The house, though beautiful, was suffocating. It was filled with portraits of Ethan's ancestors, each staring down at her with cold, impassive eyes. She couldn't escape the feeling that they were judging her, silently accusing her of being unworthy of their bloodline. The tension finally came to a head when Amelia found herself at an event hosted by the Wells family, another grand gala, full of their wealthy friends, their old connections, and a parade of faces that seemed to blend into one another. It was there, surrounded by elegant dresses and stiff formalities, that she had her first real confrontation with Ethan's mother. Victoria had been colder than usual that night, barely acknowledging Amelia's presence. As the evening wore on, Amelia found herself standing alone by the window, gazing out at the city lights. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to find Victoria standing behind her, her face tight with something Amelia couldn't quite place. The older woman smiled, but it was forced, a smile that never reached her eyes. "You know, Amelia," Victoria said, her tone sharp, "Ethan comes from a long line of people who've worked very hard to build this family's name. It's not just a title. It's a legacy. I hope you understand that." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. The subtle venom in Victoria's words was unmistakable. The message was clear: she didn't belong. Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? How could she possibly explain the pride she took in her own accomplishments when all Victoria saw was a woman who was trying to break into a world she would never be allowed to enter? Instead, Amelia nodded stiffly, forcing a smile. "Of course I understand," she said, her voice quieter than she had intended. As she left the party that night, walking alongside Ethan through the long, empty halls of the mansion, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. She had given so much of herself, tried so hard to fit into this world, and yet she was still an outsider. The realization hit her hard: she didn't belong here. And if she didn't find a way to change things, she never would. Amelia's first few days in the Wells estate had felt like a strange dream. The grandeur of the mansion, with its towering ceilings and marble floors, seemed like something out of a history book. But as the days wore on, that initial awe faded, replaced by a growing sense of alienation. When she had walked through the front doors as Ethan's bride, she had hoped that this house, this monument to old money and tradition, would one day feel like her home. But it never did. Not once. 2 days after their wedding, Amelia had moved into the Wells family estate, with its sprawling gardens and ornate furnishings that were carefully preserved by generations of Wells caretakers. It was beautiful, imposing, filled with portraits of men and women long since passed, their eyes cold and unblinking as they seemed to judge her every step. And that's how it felt, like she was living in someone else's house. Amelia quickly realized that this wasn't just any house. It was a museum of legacy and history, and she was merely an interloper. Every room was a silent witness to the Wells family's control, their unyielding hold on tradition. Amelia had been made to feel like a visitor in her own life. Ethan had assured her that she would grow accustomed to it, that over time, she would come to appreciate the house's grandeur, its timeless beauty. But as she roamed the halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider. Every room felt like a place where she didn't belong. There were portraits of Ethan's ancestors hanging on the walls, their faces painted with dispassionate precision. Men and women whose legacy had been carved out through wealth, influence, and power, and there was Amelia, alone, adrift in a sea of faces who had long since passed and who would never accept her. But it wasn't just the house itself. It was the way that Ethan's mother, Victoria, had made her feel. Victoria had lived in this house her entire life, and as far as she was concerned, it would always be hers. The house, the family, the legacy, everything. And in her eyes, Amelia was an outsider who had come to ruin it all. The tension between them grew in the days that followed. At first, it was subtle. A glance here, a slight there. But as the weeks wore on, it became harder to ignore. Victoria was in charge, and everyone knew it. She controlled the staff. She controlled Ethan. And now, Amelia felt as though she was being slowly pushed to the periphery, like a piece of furniture no one paid attention to. It wasn't just in the house, though. It was in every aspect of their life. Amelia was never asked for her opinion. Whenever she entered a room, the conversation would stop, like everyone was waiting for her to leave. There was no warmth, no kindness. She was an afterthought, a mere footnote in the Wells family's carefully scripted narrative. And then, it started to seep into the small things. The things that, at first, Amelia had overlooked. Like how the staff would glance at her, offering nothing more than cold politeness. Or how Ethan's mother, Victoria, would make subtle comments about how a woman of your background might not understand the finer things in life. She wasn't cruel, but her words were sharp, calculated, designed to remind Amelia that she wasn't one of them. The worst of it came when Ethan's father, Charles, made a passing remark about her family. "I can see why Ethan would fall for you," he'd said one evening over dinner. "But I hope you realize that you can't take the country girl out of you." His tone had been casual, but there was an undercurrent of mockery in his words. It wasn't just a passing remark, it was a reminder that no matter what Amelia had accomplished in her life, she was still just the daughter of a small-town family, a woman who didn't belong in their world. Amelia tried to brush it off. She told herself that they would eventually come to accept her. But deep down, she knew that they never would. She could try to change the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, but no matter what she did, she would always be seen as an outsider. And yet, it was more than just being an outsider in their world. It was the subtle sense of control that Victoria exerted over every aspect of their lives. It was how she made decisions without ever consulting Amelia. How she took charge of the house, the staff, and even Ethan, without ever considering Amelia's input. Amelia had thought that marriage would be a partnership, an equal sharing of life's burdens and joys. But with each passing day, she realized that Ethan's family was not interested in partnership. They didn't want her to be a part of their world. They wanted her to submit to it, to become another cog in the machine, another member of their perfect, polished dynasty. It was one afternoon, when Amelia was sitting alone in the garden, that the true weight of it all hit her. The garden was beautiful, lush greenery and flowers of every color. It was a peaceful retreat from the cold, sterile interior of the house. But even here, in this quiet space, Amelia felt the suffocating weight of her situation. She had tried to talk to Ethan about it, to explain how lonely and isolated she felt. But every time she did, he would smile and tell her that things would get better with time. "They're just old-fashioned," he would say. "They don't know how to show love the way we do." But Amelia wasn't so sure. She had spent her whole life fighting to be seen, to prove that she was more than just her background, that she was capable of achieving greatness. She had fought to become a successful surgeon, to build a life that was hers, one that she could be proud of. But here, in this house, in this family, her accomplishments seemed meaningless. She wasn't just fighting to be seen. She was fighting to be respected, to be accepted as an equal. But that wasn't something that could be won with time. It was something that had to be given freely, and no one was offering it to her. Her thoughts were interrupted when Victoria appeared in the doorway, her expression cold but polite. "I hope you're enjoying the garden, Amelia," she said, her voice laced with an edge. "But I'd appreciate it if you didn't get too comfortable. It's not exactly your place." Amelia stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She had expected the words, but hearing them out loud was a different experience. With a tight smile, she nodded. "Of course. I'll remember that." As she walked back into the house, a wave of despair washed over her. She had known from the beginning that Ethan's family would be difficult to win over, but she hadn't expected this coldness, this rejection, this sense of being invisible in her own home. Amelia knew that her life in this house would never be the same. And soon, she would have to decide just how much she was willing to sacrifice to keep Ethan and his family happy. The question was it worth it? It had been 3 months since Amelia had moved into the Wells estate, and though she had learned to navigate the house's silent disapproval, the cracks were starting to show. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that time would heal the tension. But instead, it deepened, became more entrenched, more apparent with each passing day. Victoria, Ethan's mother, was a master of passive aggression. Her comments were subtle but cutting, as though she were merely offering suggestions, but Amelia could feel the sting behind them. She should dress more elegantly, Victoria would say, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her tone would drip with a thinly veiled disapproval, as though Amelia's simple, yet tasteful wardrobe somehow offended her. Or how she should learn to speak more properly, as if Amelia's every word and mannerism were an affront to their aristocratic lineage. At first, Amelia had tried to respond in kind, offering polite smiles and kind words, convincing herself that these slights were simply misunderstandings. But as the months passed, the insults became harder to ignore. She no longer felt like she was a part of this family, but rather an outsider desperately trying to fit in. It was as though her very presence was an offense. Her background, her achievements, even her education seemed to mean nothing here. And then, there was Richard, Ethan's father. His manner was different from his wife's, but it was no less oppressive. While Victoria preferred to mask her disdain with politeness, Richard's comments were blunt, almost casual in their cruelty. "You know, Amelia, not everyone is cut out for the high society life," he had remarked one evening at dinner, as though it were an innocent observation. "You'll get used to it, though. I'm sure Ethan will help you adjust." The words weren't malicious, but the message was clear: she didn't belong, and if she wasn't careful, she never would. For weeks, Amelia fought to keep her cool. She took solace in Ethan's reassuring words, words she desperately wanted to believe. "They're just old-fashioned," he had told her. "They don't know how to show love the way we do. Just give them time." But deep down, Amelia knew the truth. Time wasn't going to change anything. She was fighting a losing battle, and it wasn't just about her. It was about Ethan, about their life together, and the family that was slowly suffocating her. The final blow came when Amelia discovered she was pregnant. At first, she had thought that this news, this new life growing inside her, would be the thing that finally brought the Wells family around. A child, after all, should have the power to soften even the coldest hearts. It should have been a reason to celebrate. But when she shared the news with Ethan's family, the reaction was far from what she had imagined. Victoria's smile, thin and practiced, faltered for just a moment before she composed herself. "How delightful," she had said. Her voice was flat, but her eyes told a different story. Richard, on the other hand, said nothing, merely nodding as if the announcement were some trivial matter that held no significance. It was then that Amelia understood. Her pregnancy wasn't a cause for joy to them. It was merely another point of contention, another reason to look down on her. They weren't excited about their future grandchild. They were calculating, coldly considering how this would impact their family's future and their perfect, polished image. When Ethan came to her later that night, he tried to console her. "They're just old-fashioned," he said again, as though repeating the words would somehow make them true. "They'll come around. I promise." But Amelia wasn't sure she believed him anymore. As her pregnancy progressed, the atmosphere in the Wells estate only grew colder. The tension between Amelia and Victoria was palpable. Victoria, who had once been so composed and elegant, now seemed to take an almost vindictive pleasure in making Amelia's life difficult. She began to impose her will on everything related to the pregnancy, the nursery design, the baby's clothes, even the child's name. Amelia had expected her to be involved, of course, but the manner in which Victoria took control was unsettling. One evening, as Amelia sat in the nursery, attempting to sort through the baby's things, she found herself being interrupted by Victoria's sudden arrival. The older woman glided into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, and before Amelia could speak, she began issuing orders. "We'll need a new crib," she said, surveying the room with an air of finality. "This one's far too old-fashioned. I'll have someone pick up a more appropriate one tomorrow." Amelia's heart sank as she watched her mother-in-law begin rearranging things, moving items that Amelia had carefully selected for the baby, as though everything she had done was wrong. "No, Victoria," Amelia said, her voice trembling with restraint. "I've already made these decisions. I want to keep it this way." But Victoria merely raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Amelia, darling," she said with a cool smile. "You're new to all this. Let me help." That was when Amelia realized the truth. This wasn't just about a nursery. This wasn't about her child. This was about control. And no matter how much Amelia tried to assert herself, Victoria would never allow her to have the upper hand. The Wells family's legacy was built on control, and nothing was going to change that. As the days wore on, the subtle war between mother and daughter-in-law intensified. Victoria's passive-aggressive comments became more pointed, and Amelia's sense of isolation deepened. She wasn't just fighting for her place in the family anymore. She was fighting for her autonomy, for her right to make decisions about her own life, her own family. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about everything, the life she had built for herself, the dream she had of raising a child in a home filled with love, not control and manipulation. But Amelia knew that this was just the beginning. If she wanted to survive in this family, if she wanted to keep her sanity and her dignity intact, she would have to fight back. And this time she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Victoria, take away what was rightfully hers. Amelia had been hoping that the birth of her child would somehow ease the tension that hung over the Wells estate, but it only magnified the distance between her and Ethan's family. When the day came, she had been surrounded by doctors and nurses, a sterile environment far from what she had imagined for this moment. Ethan was by her side, but even his presence seemed distant, as though he too had been swallowed by the expectations of his family. The delivery went smoothly, and when she finally held her baby girl, her heart was filled with a joy she had never known. She looked down at her daughter, her little face scrunched up in peaceful sleep, and for a fleeting moment, everything seemed perfect. This child, Sophia, was the product of their love, a symbol of their future together. But that sense of peace shattered the moment Victoria entered the room. Victoria had been hovering in the background since the moment Amelia entered the hospital, giving her space only when she deemed it necessary. She had insisted on being there for the birth, despite Amelia's attempts to keep the occasion private. "It's tradition, dear," she had said with a thin smile. "We wouldn't dream of missing the birth of our granddaughter." The moment she walked in, Amelia's sense of ownership over the moment began to slip away. Victoria's eyes were cold, calculating. The moment she laid eyes on Sophia, her expression softened into something that could only be described as possession. Victoria immediately took the baby from Amelia's arms. "Let me hold her," she said softly, but the forcefulness in her tone was undeniable. Amelia tried to protest, but her mother-in-law wasn't interested in listening. "You need your rest," Victoria continued, her grip on Sophia firm. Amelia felt a surge of frustration, but Ethan, standing quietly by the door, offered a weak smile and nodded.
Let her hold her, Amelia.
She just wants to help. The words felt hollow. Amelia could see the subtle message in Ethan's eyes. He wasn't going to stand up to his mother. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Amelia leaned back in her bed, her hands trembling, but she watched closely as Victoria cradled her daughter. The scene should have felt like a moment of joy, but to Amelia, it felt like the beginning of a war over her child. Victoria was taking control, claiming ownership over her baby in a way that was both subtle and ruthless. Later that evening, when Amelia had finally settled into a quiet moment with her daughter, she stepped into the nursery to check on Sophia. But what she saw stopped her in her tracks. Victoria was standing by the crib, rearranging the baby's clothes and adjusting the soft pastel blankets. The nursery, which Amelia had so carefully decorated with light, bright colors, now felt like an entirely different place. The walls, once adorned with soft floral prints and family photos, were now bare, with only a few expensive pieces of art hanging on the walls. The rocking chair Amelia had picked out was gone, replaced by a more traditional one that matched the Wells family's style. "You've done well," Victoria said, as if she were speaking to a child. "But this will be better." Amelia's heart dropped. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with a quiet anger. "What did you do?" Victoria didn't look up from her work. "We all want what's best for Sophia," she said with a serene smile, as though the words were a well-rehearsed script. But Amelia wasn't fooled. The truth was clear. This wasn't about what was best for Sophia. This was about control. Victoria wasn't just rearranging the room. She was rearranging Amelia's life, erasing any trace of her influence and making it clear that this was her family now. Amelia's chest tightened, and for the first time since the birth of her daughter, she felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. She had known that Victoria and Richard were manipulative, but she hadn't realized the depths of their control. They wanted to dominate every aspect of her life, from her marriage to the very nursery where her child would sleep. As she stood there, staring at the room that should have been hers, Amelia felt the weight of the years of silent battles she had fought, of the subtle cruelties and the constant undermining. It wasn't just about the nursery. It was about her autonomy, her right to make decisions about her life and her child. The tears that had threatened to fall for weeks finally spilled over, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, of defiance. She wasn't going to let them take this from her. That night, as she lay awake in bed, the weight of the day pressing on her chest, she made a decision. She had given up too much. She had given up her dignity, her voice, and her space. She had allowed Victoria to take control for too long. But not anymore. She wouldn't let them take her daughter from her. Sophia was her child. And Amelia would fight for her, with everything she had. The next morning, Amelia didn't wait for Ethan's approval. She knew he wouldn't support her. She knew that her battle wasn't with him, it was with the Wells family, with everything they represented. So she made a call. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in family law, one who was known for taking on powerful families. She couldn't trust Ethan to stand up for her. But she could trust herself. It was time to take back control. It was time to fight for her daughter.
The battle had only just begun.
The days that followed were a blur of anger, confusion, and a growing sense of isolation. Amelia could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, and it wasn't just the financial pressure or the legal battle she had started, it was the crushing realization that Ethan was not the ally she had hoped for. In fact, he had become more of a silent spectator to her suffering than the husband she had believed he would be. She had known for some time that their marriage was strained, but now it was clear, Ethan wasn't going to fight for her. He wasn't going to protect her from his family. The man she had loved had chosen his bloodline over her, over their daughter. It wasn't a choice he made consciously, but the effect was the same. Every glance he gave her, every apology that never reached his eyes, confirmed the truth. As the weeks passed, Amelia began to feel like an outsider in her own home. The Wells family continued their slow, insidious encroachment into every aspect of her life, and Ethan, as always, was absent when it mattered. The legal papers she had filed were already on their way to his hands, and the bitterness in her stomach grew with each passing day. She was about to fight a battle for her daughter, but she was doing it alone. The breaking point came one evening at a formal dinner held in the Wells family's honor. It was supposed to be a celebration, but to Amelia, it felt more like a prison sentence. The guests, all of them friends and colleagues of Richard and Victoria, were all too eager to stare and whisper behind their glasses of champagne. She could feel their eyes on her, evaluating her every move. No one had said anything outright, but the air was thick with judgment. Amelia had tried to prepare herself for the evening, tried to look the part of the poised, calm wife that they expected. She had dressed in a modest, elegant gown, her hair carefully styled, and her face set in the practiced smile she had learned to wear when she was around them. But nothing she did seemed to make her feel like she belonged. As the dinner wound on, the inevitable happened. Victoria's friend, a woman from their social circle who Amelia had met only once before, leaned against the edge of the table. With an air of exaggerated grace, she knocked over her glass of red wine, sending it splashing onto Amelia's dress. Amelia froze, feeling the wetness seep through the fabric, staining her skin. The silence that followed was deafening. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," the woman said with a wide, insincere smile, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "I didn't mean to." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't just the wine, it was the humiliation. The entire room was staring, and she could already hear the whispers start to swirl. Ethan, who had been seated beside her, barely glanced up from his plate. "It's okay," he said distractedly. "Just clean it up." Her chest tightened. The familiar anger began to rise, but this time, it wasn't just at the situation, it was at Ethan, at everything he had allowed to happen. He hadn't stood up for her, not even when the woman had blatantly humiliated her in front of everyone. He hadn't even looked her in the eyes. His indifference felt like the final betrayal. The laughter that followed from the guests felt like an attack on her very soul. It was as though they had been waiting for her to fail, and now that she had, they reveled in it. Amelia's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back with such force that it tipped over. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, ignoring the stares that followed her every step. Once in the solitude of her room, her heart shattered. She wanted to scream, to punch the walls, to do anything to release the suffocating rage inside her. But there was no one to fight.
No one to turn to.
Not even Ethan. The realization settled in her chest like a stone, she was alone. And it was time to stop waiting for someone else to fix this. No one was going to save her, and no one was going to save Sophia either. It was on her, on Amelia, to protect her child, even if it meant destroying everything she had once hoped for. As the tears finally fell, they were not just from pain. They were from a deep, irrevocable decision that had been made. She had endured their cruelty for far too long, and the time had come for her to fight back. She wasn't going to let them take her daughter. The next morning, She didn't even bother to speak with Ethan. She didn't need his approval anymore. Amelia knew what she had to do. The legal papers were already on their way, but she needed something more. She needed ammunition, something to give her the edge. That's when she began to dig into the Wells family, into the lives of the people who had so casually destroyed her world. She couldn't trust Ethan. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in his family's lies. But the rest of them, Victoria, Richard, would be the key to her victory. And she would find their secrets. She would make them pay. She didn't care how hard the fight would be. She didn't care how much she would lose. Amelia would do whatever it took to protect her daughter. And if that meant tearing apart the Wells family, then so be it. There was no turning back now. The days following her decision were a blur of cold determination and frantic preparation. Amelia knew she couldn't stay in that house another moment. She couldn't keep living under the Wells family's suffocating control. But as much as she longed for freedom, the path ahead was fraught with obstacles. The Wells had more power, more resources, and more influence than she could ever imagine. If she was going to leave, she would have to be smart. She started by gathering everything she would need for the fight ahead. Legal papers, financial records, and proof of the emotional toll her marriage had taken on her, everything she could use to her advantage. But the most important thing was Sophia. She couldn't allow her daughter to be swept away by the Wells family. She had already seen what they were capable of, how they viewed Sophia as a mere pawn in their game. Amelia would not allow them to take her child from her. The night she finally made up her mind, she found herself standing at the door of Sophia's nursery. The soft sound of her daughter's breathing filled the room, and for a moment, Amelia hesitated. She looked at her sleeping angel, the little girl who had brought so much joy into her life, and wondered if she was making the right decision. But deep down, she knew there was no other choice. Her daughter's future was at stake. And if that meant leaving everything behind, her home, her marriage, the life she had built, then so be it. Amelia packed quickly, moving silently through the house, gathering her daughter's essentials. She didn't even bother to look back at the grand, imposing mansion. It wasn't her home anymore. It never had been. As she stepped into the hallway, her heart raced. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a thunderclap, as if the entire house might wake up and come crashing down on her. But there was no turning back. Not now. With Sophia in her arms, Amelia walked out of the mansion, through the back door and into the cold night air. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the grounds. It was eerie quiet, and yet, for the first time in months, Amelia felt a strange sense of calm. She had done it. She had escaped. But as soon as the door closed behind her, the weight of the world settled on her shoulders. She was out, yes, but now what? Where would she go? How could she protect Sophia from the Wells family's wrath? Ethan wouldn't let this go easily. He would come after her. His family would come after her. They had the means, the connections, the lawyers to fight her at every turn. Amelia had to think quickly. She couldn't afford to make a wrong move. She made her way to the nearest hotel, one tucked away in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, but it was safe for the moment. She rented a room under a false name, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of the escape. Once she settled in, Amelia didn't waste any time. She immediately contacted a lawyer, a man named Daniel Lawson, who specialized in high-profile custody cases. He was the best in the business, and she needed someone who could help her fight the Wells family and protect Sophia from the manipulation they had been so skilled at using for years. She met with Daniel the next morning. He was an imposing figure, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. Amelia explained everything: her marriage, her escape, the Wells family's control over her life, and her fears about their influence over Sophia's future. Daniel listened carefully, his expression serious. He took the file she had brought, flipping through them quickly, his brow furrowing as he examined the evidence. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "This isn't going to be easy," he said, his voice steady. "The Wells family has deep pockets, and they're not going to let you go without a fight. They'll do whatever it takes to get Sophia back, and they won't play fair." Amelia nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the papers in her lap. "I'm ready for a fight. I'm not going to let them take her from me. I won't let them win." Daniel's eyes softened slightly. "I believe you. But you need to understand something. This isn't just a legal battle. It's a war.
The Wells family will drag you through the mud, ty to ruin your reputation, and paint you as an unfit motor.
They'll use everything they have to make sure you don't win. And they will try to use Ethan against you too. The mention of Ethan's name sent a jolt through Amelia's chest. She hadn't thought much about him since the night she left, but the truth was, he was her biggest obstacle. If he sided with his family, it would be impossible to win. She could already picture the look in his eyes, the disappointment, the cold indifference. But Amelia wasn't going to let that stop her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down. I know what I'm up against, she said, her voice firm. But I'm not afraid.
Du warte für Tages.
Daniel nodded, then stood up, extending his hand to her. Then let's get started. We've got a long road ahead of us. Amelia shook his hand, feeling a sense of resolve wash over her. She had taken the first step in a fight that would change everything. She was no longer just fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her daughter, for her freedom, and for a future where the Wells family couldn't control her every move.
The battle had begun.
And Amelia was ready.
The disblured into a relentless, grueling Erhabselunterm.
Amelia kept a low profile, doing everything she could to protect herself and Sophia from the inevitable retaliation that would come from the Wells family. They had money, power, and connections that spanned generations. She had a fierce determination and a lawyer who believed in her cause. But nothing could truly prepare her for what was about to come. Amelia spent her days reviewing legal documents, consulting with Daniel Lawson, and doing everything she could to build a strong case for custody. But at night, when the world fell silent, her mind would race with thoughts of what might happen if she failed. What if Jason sided with his family? What if the court decided Sophia belonged with the Wells, in their perfect mansion, with their perfect legacy? Sophia, oblivious to the weight of the battle they were both in, would crawl into Amelia's lap at night, wrapping her tiny arms around her mother's neck. "I love you, Mommy," she would whisper, her soft voice bringing both comfort and agony. Amelia squeezed her daughter tighter, her heart heavy with the fear of losing her. Each time she looked into Sophia's innocent eyes, she found new strength. Amelia wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her daughter's future, for her right to grow up free from the toxicity that had poisoned her own life. And she would do whatever it took to make sure Sophia was never exposed to it again. It wasn't long before Jason's legal team made their first move. The Wells family had the best lawyers money could buy, and they were relentless. They painted Amelia as unstable, a woman who had run away in a moment of weakness, a woman who had deprived her husband and his family of their rightful role in Sophia's life. They made it seem like she had kidnapped their child, a desperate attempt to hold on to her. But Daniel Lawson was prepared. He fought back with everything he had, countering every false claim with the evidence Amelia had gathered. He spoke about Jason's absence from their marriage, about the long hours he spent away, the neglect he had shown toward Sophia, and the cold, calculating control that had been wielded by the Wells family. They were trying to make it seem like Amelia was the villain in all of this, but Daniel was determined to expose the truth. He reminded the court that while the Wells family had money and power, that didn't make them the ideal parents. He reminded them that Jason's family had a history of manipulation, of using their wealth to control people, and of making sure that nothing ever stood in their way. As the court hearings dragged on, Amelia's nerves began to fray. The Wells' strategy was clear. They were trying to wear her down, to make her question her own strength. They brought in experts, they made damaging accusations, and they tried to paint her as unfit. But Amelia stood firm. She would not be broken by their lies. One day, during a particularly brutal cross-examination, Amelia's composure cracked. The lawyer representing the Wells family, a slick and arrogant man, had asked her a question designed to humiliate her. "How could you possibly think you're capable of raising a child?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've run away from your husband and his family. You've abandoned your child's rightful place in a home filled with stability." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to that single question, a cruel jab meant to tear her apart. She could hear the whispers of the courtroom, the subtle judgment in the air. She could see Jason sitting across from her, his face a mask of indifference, as if he wasn't even the person she had once loved. But then something inside of her snapped. She had been told she wasn't enough for so long. She had been made to feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong in the world Jason had created. She had been humiliated, belittled, and reduced to a pawn in his family's game. But in that moment, Amelia realized something crucial. She didn't need them. She didn't need their wealth, their approval, or their image of what she should be. She had survived on her own, built her own career, fought for her daughter's safety, and sacrificed everything to protect Sophia. That was what made her strong, not the family name or the money. Amelia stood up, her voice steady despite the fury burning inside her. I'm capable because I love my daughter more than anything in this world. I'm capable because I've worked hard to provide for her, to give her a life free of manipulation and control. I'm capable because I've spent every moment of my life making sure she knows that she's important, that she's worthy of love, and that she deserves to live a life of her own making. The room fell silent. Even the lawyer, who had been so certain of his position, seemed momentarily taken aback. But Amelia didn't stop there. I may not have the legacy or the money that your family prides itself on, she continued, her voice rising in strength. But I have something much more valuable. I have the truth. And I have the love of my daughter. And that is all I need to win this fight. For the first time in weeks, Amelia felt a sense of power flow through her. She was no longer the woman who had been broken by the Wells family. She was a mother, a fighter, and a woman who had finally found her voice. And just as she finished speaking, she saw something shift in Jason's eyes. For the first time, he seemed to question everything. The perfect image of his family, the life they had built together, it all started to crumble in front of him. The battle wasn't over, but Amelia knew that she had just made the most powerful statement of her life. The Wells family might have money, but she had something that couldn't be bought. And that was all she needed to win. As she walked out of the courtroom that day, Amelia felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight for Sophia's future was far from over, but she was ready. This wasn't just about custody. It was about reclaiming her life and her dignity. And she would stop at nothing to make sure her daughter had the future she deserved, one that was free from the toxic grip of the Wells family. The days following that courtroom showdown felt like an endless tug of war. Amelia's victory in making her statement had given her a renewed sense of purpose, but she knew the fight was far from over. The Wells family wasn't about to let their prized image fall apart, not without a brutal fight. And they had the power and resources to make sure that Amelia's resolve would be tested at every turn. Jason's legal team shifted their strategy. They had taken notice of her unyielding spirit and the impact her words had on the courtroom. They no longer saw her as a meek, uncertain woman. She had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous, someone who would stop at nothing to protect her daughter. The first salvo came in the form of a bombshell accusation. Jason's lawyers claimed that Amelia was unfit to care for Sophia, arguing that her career as a surgeon made her too busy and emotionally distant to provide the stable home that a child needed. They painted a picture of a mother who was neglectful, someone more interested in her professional success than in being present for her daughter. The accusation stung deeply, but Amelia knew it was just another move to wear her down, to make her doubt her worth. But instead of cowering, Amelia used it as fuel. Her passion for Sophia was unmatched, and she was prepared to fight tooth and nail for the right to raise her daughter in peace. She knew that being a mother didn't have to mean sacrificing her career. She had done it all on her own, building her life as a surgeon, dedicating herself to her craft, and proving that a woman could have it all. Daniel, ever the calm and calculated lawyer, helped her craft her response. "You say Dr. Williams is too busy to be a good mother," he said in one of their strategy sessions. "But let's talk about the Wells family legacy. How many days a year does Jason spend at home with his daughter? How many times has he actually played with Sophia, or been there when she needed him?" Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she signed off on the document, but the fire inside her was unmistakable. They were attempting to tear her down, but she would not be made to feel guilty for working hard to provide for her family. It was a fight she'd been willing to wage since the moment she had decided to leave everything behind and take Sophia with her. There was no turning back now. The next hearing was scheduled, and both sides were preparing for the next round of attacks. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the Wells family's lawyers presented their arguments. They painted Amelia as the villain in their story, a woman who had torn apart the perfect family in pursuit of her own selfish desires. Their words were sharp, their strategy designed to make the judge question Amelia's motives, and they would stop at nothing to win. But Daniel was ready. With every accusation they lobbed at her, Daniel fought back harder. He presented witness testimonies from people who had worked with Amelia over the years, from colleagues who could vouch for her dedication to her patients and her ability to balance her demanding career with her responsibilities as a mother. He called in character witnesses who spoke of Amelia's kindness, her strength, and her unwavering love for her daughter. It was a calculated and meticulous assault on the Wells family's narrative. The tide was beginning to turn. Jason, however, remained a stoic presence in the courtroom. Amelia couldn't read him anymore. He had gone from the man who had promised to stand by her, to someone who seemed indifferent to her struggles. His silence spoke volumes. He wasn't fighting for her anymore, and he wasn't fighting for their family. He was fighting for control, for a life that didn't involve the messiness of this custody battle. But his indifference wasn't enough to deter Amelia. It only made her more resolute. She could see the cracks in the perfect facade the Wells family had built. Beneath the polished surface, there was a hunger for power, a desire to keep everything under their thumb. They had never truly cared about Sophia. They wanted her because she was a tool, a way to preserve their legacy and their influence. And that, Amelia realized, was the biggest betrayal of all. As the court proceedings dragged on, the Wells family continued to throw everything they had at her. They brought in psychological evaluations, hired experts to assess Amelia's mental state, and even tried to paint her as someone who was unfit to care for Sophia because of the stress of the ongoing litigation. But every move they made seemed to backfire. Amelia wasn't just fighting for custody anymore. She was fighting for the truth, and for the life she had built for Sophia, free from the suffocating grip of the Wells family. She was fighting for the future that she knew was possible, a future where Sophia could grow up with love, with honesty, and with the freedom to choose her own path. One afternoon, as the case began to near its conclusion, Amelia received an unexpected call from a private investigator she had hired weeks earlier. The investigator had uncovered something that could change everything, a series of emails between Richard Wells and one of his business partners that hinted at financial corruption, money laundering, and illegal dealings that could easily be used to discredit the Wells family's claim to Sophia. This was it, the piece of evidence that could prove they were unfit, that they had been hiding behind a facade of respectability for far too long. Amelia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the documents in front of her, her heart racing. This wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about justice. It was about showing the court who the real villains were in this story. The Wells family had used their power and influence for far too long. Now, it was time to turn the tables. With a deep breath, Amelia called Daniel. "We have them," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and triumph. "I've got the proof we need." The fight wasn't over yet. But with this evidence in hand, Amelia felt a renewed sense of hope. The Wells family may have been powerful, but they had underestimated one thing: Amelia Williams was not a woman to be easily defeated. The courtroom was quiet as the judge prepared to hear the final statements. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She had anticipated this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, everything felt so much heavier than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about proving that she was a better mother. It was about exposing the Wells family for who they truly were. It was about taking the control they had so easily wielded over her life and her daughter's future, and turning it on them. Amelia knew that her biggest weapon had yet to be revealed: the documents she had obtained through the private investigator. Those emails, those corrupt dealings, they had the power to change the trajectory of everything. With this evidence in her possession, the Wells family could no longer hide behind their golden masks of respectability. They could no longer pretend to be the perfect, upstanding family that everyone believed them to be. Daniel met her in the hallway before the hearing began, his expression grave but determined. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. Amelia took a deep breath, clutching the manila folder tightly in her hands. "I have to be. This is the only way we'll win." She could feel the weight of the folder, the contents heavy with the potential to shatter the Wells family's empire. Richard Wells, with his smug smile and air of superiority, would never see it coming. But it was more than that, it was the truth. And no matter how hard they tried to hide it, the truth always found a way to come out. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the lawyers from both sides stood, preparing to make their final statements. Jason sat stiffly at the table, his face unreadable. His lawyers had done their best to paint Amelia as an unstable, selfish woman. But Jason's indifference toward his own daughter had become glaringly obvious. He wasn't there for Sophia. He wasn't there for her, and he never truly had been.
Daniel Rose Fürst, Confidentes Alves.
He made his way to the front of the courtroom, the eyes of the jury following his every movement. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but strong, "what we have here is not a simple custody battle. This is about a family that has been manipulating the truth, hiding their true intentions behind wealth and power." He paused, letting his words sink in, and then continued, "My client, Dr. Amelia Williams, is not the villain here. She is a mother, doing everything in her power to protect her daughter from a family who has shown nothing but contempt for her. They have been willing to destroy the life of an innocent child, and for what? To maintain their image of perfection." Amelia could feel the weight of every word Daniel spoke. It was everything she had been feeling for so long, the frustration, the hurt, the injustice. She was finally hearing her truth spoken aloud. The Wells family's carefully constructed image was being torn apart in front of everyone, and there was no turning back now. When it was the Wells team's turn, they put up a fierce defense. Jason's lawyer stood with a calculated expression, speaking in the same polished tone that had charmed many of their influential friends. "Your Honor," he began, "my client, Mr. Jason Wells, is a hard-working man, a loving father, and a responsible member of society. His family's legacy is built on integrity, and he has always provided his daughter with the best that money can offer. It is clear that Dr. Williams has acted rashly, taking matters into her own hands in a way that is not only reckless but damaging to Sophia's future." The lawyer's words were smooth, designed to create doubt in the minds of the jury. But Amelia wasn't fooled. She had seen through the Wells family long ago. She knew that this wasn't about love, or family, or anything genuine. This was about power, about control. And they would use any means necessary to keep that power intact. As Jason's lawyer continued his speech, Daniel leaned over to Amelia. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Amelia nodded. Her heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She slid the folder across the table to Daniel, who stood and approached the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice firm, "I have something here that changes everything." He opened the manila folder, pulling out the evidence they had worked so hard to gather: the emails, the financial records, the sordid details of the Wells family's corruption. The room fell into stunned silence as Daniel began to read aloud. The words echoed through the courtroom, each one more damning than the last. He spoke of hidden offshore accounts, illegal tax evasions, shady business deals that Richard Wells had conducted behind the backs of his own colleagues. He detailed the way the Wells family had laundered money to maintain their lavish lifestyle, all the while pretending to be upstanding citizens. It was a revelation that left everyone in the room stunned. Amelia felt a strange sense of satisfaction as the words filled the air. The Wells family's lies were unraveling before everyone's eyes. Jason, who had once been so sure of his position, now looked as if the ground was slipping out from under him. His face paled as he glanced at his parents, who were sitting stiffly beside him. Richard Wells, the patriarch of the family, seemed to grow smaller with each word that Daniel read. His carefully crafted persona of the benevolent family leader was dissolving, replaced by the image of a man who had been caught in his own web of deceit. Amelia could feel the weight of her triumph, but she knew this wasn't over. She could see the Wells family's shock, their anger, and the flicker of fear in their eyes. They would not give up easily, but the truth had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it now. As the judge called for a recess, Amelia sat back in her chair, her heart still racing. This battle had only just begun, but for the first time since the fight for Sophia's custody had begun, she felt hopeful. The Wells family had underestimated her, and now they would see what happened when a mother who had nothing left to lose fought for her child. It wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about justice, about revealing the truth for what it was, and about making sure Sophia's future was never tainted by the lies of the Wells family. And Amelia was going to make sure of it. The courtroom was tense. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Amelia sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been through so much, endured so many sleepless nights, endless meetings, and legal battles, but this moment was different. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for, the moment when she would either reclaim her life and her daughter, or be cast back into the suffocating grip of the Wells family. The judge had called for a recess, but now he was back, sitting in his high chair, his gavel in hand. His expression was stern, unreadable. Daniel had made a compelling case. The evidence against the Wells family was irrefutable. But as much as Amelia wanted to believe that justice would prevail, she couldn't shake the fear that the Wells' influence might still tip the scales in their favor. Jason sat at the table, his gaze fixed on the floor, his once confident posture now slumped. He had never imagined that this would happen, that the family's secrets would be exposed, that his carefully constructed world would crumble so quickly. The arrogance that had once characterized him had turned to something much darker: fear. It was a look that Amelia knew all too well, The kind of fear that came when the consequences of your actions finally caught up with you. And then there was Richard, his father. The man who had spent years building his empire, who had never been challenged, never been held accountable for his actions. Now he sat in silence, his eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of doubt behind them. The Wells family was losing control. And as much as they wanted to maintain their grip on power, they couldn't escape the truth. The judge raised his gavel and brought it down with a resounding thud. After reviewing the evidence and considering the arguments presented by both parties, I have come to a decision. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just a courtroom battle anymore. It was a battle for Sophia's future, for the life that they could build together, free from the poison of the Wells family. The judge glanced down at the papers before him, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he spoke. The court finds in favor of Dr. Amelia Williams. Temporary custody of Sophia Wells will remain with her mother. Amelia's breath caught in her chest, and for a split second, it felt as though time itself had stopped. She blinked, not quite believing what she had heard. Had the judge just ruled in her favor? Had the Wells family, with all their wealth and power, truly lost? Jason's face turned a pale shade of gray. His eyes widened as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. His lawyer stood quickly, offering a stiff nod, and began whispering frantically to him, trying to salvage whatever dignity he could. But it was too late. Richard's jaw clenched. His hand rested on the table, gripping it with white knuckles. The shock in his eyes gave way to something else, something darker, more dangerous. The Wells family had just been dealt a blow they would not recover from easily. And though they would try to fight, to claw their way back to the power they had once held, they had just lost the battle for Sophia's future. Amelia sat back in her chair, her fingers trembling slightly, but there was no joy in her heart, not yet. This was just the beginning. The judge had ruled in her favor, but the final victory was still far from certain. The Wells family would not surrender quietly. Dr. Williams, the judge continued, his voice cutting through the tense silence, I understand the gravity of this decision, and I want to be clear. This is a temporary arrangement. Full custody is still pending, and there will be further hearings to determine the best course of action for the child. Amelia nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The judge was right. This was just one battle won. But it was a crucial one. The Wells family had been exposed, their wealth and influence no longer enough to shield them from the truth. As the courtroom slowly began to empty, Daniel walked over to her, a proud smile on his face. We did it, he said softly, his voice full of admiration. Amelia's lips trembled, but she didn't smile. The weight of the decision still sat heavy in her chest, and she knew the fight wasn't over. The Wells family was powerful, and they would not let this go without a fight. But for now, they had been forced to face the consequences of their actions, and that was something Amelia could hold on to. Jason stood to leave, his eyes flicking toward Amelia before he turned away. He didn't say anything, didn't offer any apology or explanation. He simply walked out of the courtroom, a broken man. Richard followed, his expression dark, his steps heavy. The Wells family was retreating, but they would be back, that much was certain. They wouldn't give up on their daughter without a fight. But they had been shaken. The foundation of their perfect life had cracked, and now, Amelia had a chance to build something new, something better for Sophia. As they walked out of the courtroom, Daniel turned to Amelia, his voice low. You've won the first round. But don't expect them to give up easily. The real fight is still ahead. Amelia nodded, her eyes steady. I know. But I'm ready for it. I'll do whatever it takes to keep Sophia safe. To keep her away from them. The weight of what had just happened settled in, but Amelia refused to let herself be overwhelmed. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The Wells family had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price for their cruelty. But it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about Sophia, her daughter, her future. And Amelia would protect her, no matter what. She would do whatever it took to ensure that the little girl she loved would never have to face the darkness of the Wells family's world. The verdict had been delivered, and the first victory had been won. But the battle was far from over. And Amelia was ready to finish it, on her terms. Months had passed since the courtroom had echoed with that decisive ruling, but Amelia still felt the weight of the battle upon her shoulders. Each day, she grew more resolute in her decision to fight, to protect Sophia at all costs. The Wells family had retreated, humiliated and disgraced, but Amelia knew that their pride and power were not so easily extinguished. They had been quiet for too long, and their silence was only the calm before the storm. Jason, though no longer the man she had once loved, remained a part of this tangled mess. The custody battle continued, the legal wrangling endless, the days of uncertainty stretching out before her. But Amelia had something now, something she hadn't had before: hope. A hope that her life, her daughter's life, could be something more than the stifling grip of the Wells family's expectations. The day had come for another round of hearings, and Amelia stood in front of the courthouse, Sophia in her arms, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the final battle was looming. The judge's ruling had been in her favor, but the fight was far from over. Jason's team had appealed, and the Wells family would not rest until they had regained control of their precious granddaughter. But Amelia had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom months ago. She was stronger now, more certain of what she needed to do to protect Sophia. No longer intimidated by the weight of the Wells legacy, she had become the mother she had always dreamed of being. Fierce, protective, unyielding. As she entered the courtroom, she took a deep breath, steadying herself for the challenge ahead. She could feel the eyes of the Wells family on her: Eleanor, still the epitome of icy grace, her lips tight with barely contained disdain; Richard, his face a mask of anger and humiliation, but beneath that there was fear. Fear that their perfect world, the one they had spent years building, was crumbling beyond their control. Jason, too, was there. His once confident posture had diminished into something brittle, as though the weight of his family's expectations and his own guilt had crushed him. He didn't look at her as she entered, but Amelia knew he was watching. Waiting for something, a sign, a crack in her resolve that he could exploit. But she wouldn't give him that. She wouldn't give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her doubt herself. The courtroom proceedings began, and the tension in the room was palpable. The judge, who had seen this case unfold over the last several months, looked tired but resolute. He had seen the damage that had been done to Sophia, the manipulation, the control, and the cruelty of the Wells family. He knew that the decision he was about to make would alter the course of this family's future forever. "Dr. Williams," the judge began, his voice firm but not unkind, "I've reviewed the documents provided by both parties, the testimonies, and the evidence presented. This is a matter of great importance, and I must consider what is in the best interest of the child." Amelia sat still, her breath held as she gazed at the judge. She had come so far, so much farther than she had ever thought possible. She had confronted a family who had once seemed untouchable, and now the end was within reach. The judge continued. "Based on the overwhelming evidence of emotional and psychological harm caused by the Wells family's actions, I have decided to grant Dr. Amelia Williams full custody of Sophia Wells." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Amelia felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. It was as if the entire room had taken a collective breath, waiting for her reaction. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't allow herself to react. Not yet. She had fought so hard to get to this point. She wasn't going to break now. Jason's face twisted in shock, his eyes wide as though he had just been hit by a physical blow. The blood drained from his face as he looked toward his mother and father. They too were speechless, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fury. Eleanor's mouth was set in a tight line, her lips trembling with barely contained rage. Richard, on the other hand, looked as though he had just been told his entire empire had crumbled overnight. Amelia could see the realization dawning in their eyes. They had lost. They had lost everything. The Wells family's grip on their granddaughter, their legacy, their sense of control, had slipped through their fingers like sand. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, sealing the decision. Dr. Williams will assume full custody of Sophia, effective immediately. The Wells family is granted visitation rights under the condition that it is monitored and subject to a therapist's review. As the courtroom began to empty, the gravity of the moment began to settle in. Amelia looked down at Sophia, her daughter nestled in her arms, completely unaware of the fierce battle that had just been fought on her behalf. This was it. This was the moment she had been fighting for, a future on her terms, not the Wells family's. Jason didn't look at her as he walked out of the courtroom. His defeat was clear, his pride shattered. Eleanor and Richard followed behind him, their steps heavy, their heads low. They had lost the battle, but Amelia knew they would not forget. They would never forget the sting of their own failure. But for now, the victory was hers. Amelia stood tall as she walked out of the courtroom, her daughter's soft breath against her chest. The world outside felt different, lighter, freer. She had fought for Sophia, for the life they deserved, and now they could finally begin to live it. The fight had been long and painful. It had cost her more than she cared to admit. But in the end, it had all been worth it. Sophia was safe. And no one, not Jason, not Eleanor, not Richard, could take that from her. Amelia was finally free. And so was Sophia. They walked into their new life together, the future stretching out before them, full of possibilities, full of hope. The Wells family's poison could never touch them again. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story until the very end. We hope you enjoyed the journey and found it as captivating as we did. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel so you can stay updated on all our new stories and videos. We truly appreciate every like, comment, and subscription. It helps us keep creating more content that you love. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.